Welcome to another edition of Inside the Artist with your host, John J. Ruppert. Today is Tuesday, April 26, 2022, and we're taking you inside the mind of renowned author and poet Emiliano Martin. Mr. Martin has agreed to sit down with us to discuss his three-part method of poetic presentation. Mr. Martin, how are you today?
Wonderful, John. It is actually very easy. Presentations may occur in many forms. We can read in radio, we can read in television, we can read in the backyard of the house, we can read in the shower, we can read in a wedding, we can read among friends. There are many different places where we can read our works are a chain of events that we have to not necessarily maneuver, but take care, because there is a lot of preparation in doing a good poetry reading, just like anything in life.
What are some of the preparations for you?
The preparations are in accordance to the place where we are going to be reading. It's not the same to read in a church or in a library, or on stage in a big theater, or in a very intimate space. But the basic preparations are lighting and sound. It's very difficult to read in the dark, unless you memorize the poem by heart. And that is something that I do not recommend, especially for older people like me, that the memory may fail.
Now, you've mentioned in your preparation, you'll be going to different venues. So would you consider it to be an asset to know the venue in advance and also know who your listeners will be?
Absolutely, absolutely. You have to be prepared with the environment. If you're on a stage, you have to know where the edge of the stage is, otherwise you're going to fall. The basic things. You have to know how many people there are on the right, how many people there are on the left, how many people are in the center of... You have to be familiarized with the stage. If you read in a library, for example, and all the libraries have a room where readings and any kind of presentations take place, it's not that difficult because the auditorium is not that large. So all you do have to care is about lighting and sound. Sound is very important, because if the place is crowded and noisy and people cannot hear you, you have to have a good sound equipment, very proper. Otherwise, whatever we say is going to fall in deaf ears. Many times people say, "Can you hear me? Can you hear me?" Well, don't ever do that. I mean, you have to know what the sound is going to sound before you go in. Lighting, like I said earlier, it's got to be there. Otherwise, people don't pay attention to somebody reading in the dark. It's just like, are you afraid of showing up or something like that? So a lot of considerations.
What about dress?
Properly dressed. I suggest to dress up all the time, because we can always dress down. Depending on the place we read, you have to dress for the occasion. If you are reading poetry in the beach with a bunch of friends, well, you are wearing swimming trunks, pants, bikinis. You're in the beach. But if you go to a prestigious place, if you go to a church where poetry has been read, well, you have to dress up for the occasion. You should not look like a bum and expect people to pay attention to your looks. Looks are very important in life. Just about anything we do in life, there is a degree of appearance we have to maintain.
Now, do you think it should be wise to practice in front of a mirror?
It helps. It helps because the dramatic interpretation of the poem requires a little bit of drama, which means acting is involved. Not necessarily a phony act, but conviction of what you are saying. And you need a drama in your voice and your appearance. So, yes, indeed.
And what about pre-recording yourself speaking it? Like today, everybody has cell phones. Most cell phones have a recorder on there. So you think that would be good advice to record yourself and play it back and listen how you sound?
That is an excellent idea. People who are in the performing of poetry, I recommend definitely to rehearsal the poems to be read in front of an audience. Just practice with them in the house or in the kitchen, in the bathroom, wherever you have privacy to talk to yourself. And listen to what you are saying. See if it makes sense. You'll be surprised how many times we don't make sense at all. And when we hear ourselves, or even when we look at ourselves, we say, oh my God, did I say that? Do I look like that? And yes, we do say things that we don't want to say. So we have to practice.
And what about props? You think props are important?
Very, very much.
Like say if you wrote a poem about a pen and you were to take the pen out of your pocket and then you're looking at the pen as you're actually presenting the poem.
Absolutely. It's part of the drama.
Now some people may consider that a little overboard, too dramatic.
If everything in life, if it is overdone, if it is too dramatic, people are going to notice it and people will tell the difference between this guy's a phony or he's trying to be a show off. So there is everything in moderation. But you're right. If you are talking about a poem, if you're talking about a pen in the poem you're reading, it wouldn't help. It wouldn't be damaging at all to pull the pen and show people that, and the pen, blah, 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 and the pen is in your hands and it's part of the drama. It helps.
Now, what about as far as reaction? When you get reaction from the audience, should you take it in or should you act like you always get it?
Every audience is different, even though people may behave in one way or another depending on the circumstances. There is one fact that the audience may affect any actor on stage, in this case the reader. You should not allow the audience to interfere with your performance. You have a program in your mind, you know what you're going to do, you know what you're going to say. Let the audience be the audience. They will tell you if they like it or not. However, one very important thing for the performing poet is to read faces. Is not necessarily to look at people in a way that is kind of offensive, but be able to glance the auditorium and read faces. You can tell if people are enjoying it or people are up to here with you.
Speaking of reading faces, have you ever been mid-sentence or mid-poem and realized that nobody's either understanding it or nobody's getting it and you just switch it up or you just go through with it anyway? What would you suggest?
It's a very interesting question because sometimes we read a poem we have written and we are very proud of it, not thinking that that poem means nothing at all to some people in the audience. If that is the case, and you have started reading a poem, don't cut it out. Just keep doing the best you can. Just don't bring that kind of a subject for the next poem, because you already know that people are not liking it at all.
I know a lot of people don't like to read or can't write their own poems. So therefore, when they come to poetry meetings, they like to read someone else's work. Do you think that's acceptable, or?
It is acceptable in the classroom for the teacher to read Shakespeare poem. It's done all the time. If you do it in an audience with people, don't abuse it. Do it once, do it twice, but not as a show, unless you program your poetry reading as a reading about Edgar Allan Poe. People expect to hear poetry from Edgar Allan Poe, but if you are going to have a poetry reading by so-and-so, so-and-so, people are expecting to listen to the poetry of so-and-so, so-and-so. So, yes, you can insert a poem from a famous poet. I have done it all the time. It's nothing derogatory. On the contrary, it's admiration for someone you enjoy as a poet. But don't overdo it.
What about timing? How should the timing be when you're presenting the poems?
The timing of the poem is in relation to the subject. If you read a poem that is, let's say, a very sad topic, and you make it too long, people are going to be sad. And the purpose of the poetry reading is for people to enjoy the poetry reading, not to make them sad or make them to cry about. So the timing of the poem is, you have to know how to mix them up. And you have to know when to stop and when to make it longer. If you know that the poem is not working for the audience, find a way to cut it out nicely and move on to something else.
So shorten it.
Absolutely. I've done it. I've been in situations where I'm reading a poem and I go blah, 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 blah. And it's kind of a, do I really want to do that? But you don't want to say that in front of an audience. So you find a way to nicely cut it out and move on to something else.
What kind of questions have you answered during some of your presentations that people have asked you about your poetry, your presentations?
The questions people ask in a poetry reading are very different, just like people. Everybody's different. One of the basic questions is, when did you start writing? How old were you? Or what was the first poem you ever wrote? Or what is your favorite poet? Or what is your favorite poetry book? Or these are typical questions that go on from one audience to the other. And then there are particular questions about individuals. How did you come up with that particular idea? Well, that's different. Every poem is about something else, and that something else is the curiosity of the audience. So you never know what people are going to ask. If they pay attention to the poetry read, they will ask you something about the poem you have read. But in general, it's always just about the same. When did you start writing poetry? And then you tell them.
I know another thing they do during the poetry readings, whether it's virtual or in person, is someone may come up to you and may ask you your honest opinion of one of their poems. Now, whether you like it or whether you don't like it, how should you handle that?
Very delicate. It's a very delicate issue because you don't want to be sarcastic, you don't want to be nasty, you don't want to be derogatory to anybody, any peer. And our peers in poetry are many in the area. A lot of people write poetry. So you want to be gentle, but you want to be honest also. There are places where they use critique of poetry, and I've been in situations where people get really personal, and people take it personal, and that becomes a problem. So when somebody asks you, could you review my poetry? Certainly, I will do it. And if there is something grammatically wrong, the structure of the poem is wrong, I don't mind to tell people, hey, this is, I like the poem, but I found errors in the grammar, in the composition, or even in the pronunciation of the words in front of an audience. it's a very delicate issue. It has to be handled with care.
Now, what would happen if it was the other way? If someone came up to you after one of your readings and just literally destroyed one of your poems?
It's been done before.
How'd you handle it?
I remember going back maybe 20 years ago. Somebody came to me it was at the end of the reading. It was not in front of an audience, but he came to me and says, two of the poems you wrote, they were really disgusting. I said, what do you mean by disgusting? I mean, the poem, you either like it or you don't like it, but disgusting, now you have to get into details. What was so disgusting? The language, the subject, my deliverance. So it became something personal between an individual and me. So these things could happen. Again, if somebody has an opinion about our work, we simply say, that's your opinion. Thank you for telling me. I'll move on to something else.
Now, how do you feel about networking? After you do your presentation and everything's over, do you think it's necessary to walk around and talk to the other poets?
That's a very good idea. Networking is essential. One conversation leads to another conversation. That conversation is heard by somebody else around the area, and he or she joins the conversation. Next thing you know is a group of people talking about networking. Is a necessity. We need each other, because especially in the field of poetry, very few people are into poetry, and if we poets don't help each other, who will? Networking is a must. I encourage it.
You hear about this word all the time, stage fright. Have you ever had stage fright before you went on?
Some people get panicking when they know they're going to appear in front of people. That happens. In my case, I do not have stage fright, stage fear. I don't feel that way. I'm always concerned about not making a fool of myself, although I can do that very well. But no, I do not feel fear. However, I've noticed that a lot of people, they just fear talking in front of others. And there are ways to cut out the fear, and there are ways to improve. One of the ways is practice, practice, practice. Get used to. And some people can handle it naturally. They were born to talk in front of people. Others, they hide, they're afraid, they rather allow somebody else to do the talking, and it's life. It happens at work, it happens at church. But in my case, I have never felt intimidated by anybody or anything.
If someone came up to you and they said, Mr. Martin, I want to read my poetry, but I'm just so afraid. Can I read it with my back turned to the audience?
No, do not do that. You always have to face the audience. Your face have to be looking at the audience, because the audience is giving you time, attention, and if you turn around and you show them your butt or your back, your neck, no, don't do that.
Now, what if they were to say before they spoke the poetry, the reason why I'm doing this is because I have stage fright? Would that be acceptable? This way they're preparing the audience.
I know. This is a situation where people do not have their own conviction of doing what they are doing. And my advice is, look, you're not prepared. Don't even try to make a fool of yourself. Practice. Come back when you're ready.
So you definitely would advise to do it?
No, I wouldn't.
In
an open reading, I've seen it.
Really?
In an open reading, anything goes, because in an open reading, people have 3, 4, 5, 7 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever time is allocated to each individual. So a lot of things of that nature may occur, and they do. All the time. People show up, oh, this is the first time I read and I don't know what. Well, give it a try in an open reading. But of course, you cannot do that as a performing poet if you have been booked to read that evening, that afternoon, that day. You have to be ready.
So what happened in the one instance you said you saw it?
The guy accepted my invitation and he went back to the audience and took a seat.
Huh.
It happens.
So he didn't read at all?
At all, because he was shaking. His legs were like, he was a man. He was a young guy. And it doesn't matter, he could be old.
Yeah.
He was not prepared. And the poor guy says, well, I'll be back next time. And he went back to the audience and took a seat and didn't say anything.
What are some of the critiques you've gotten over the years, some of the good ones that you can remember of your writing?
I've been not deeply criticized, but I know people have been talking about my poetry, and I know not everybody like it, and I understand. I am not a poet like most people are. I'm not saying that I'm different or I'm better or worse than anybody, but my poetry has, of course, I'm the author, so I have high expectations of my works. My poetry is got music, it's got rhythm, it's got meaning, it's got a sense of philosophy, it's got a little bit of storytelling. It's a contemporary poetry, but with the flavor of perhaps the beginning of the century, like in the 1910s, the 1920s. Not even that now we are in the 21st century. I think I am about 80 years behind my time.
We understand here at Inside the Artist that the tools that you're talking about as far as the presentation, the preparation, and the aftermath, the networking, you went through this years ago and you published a manuscript. Tell us about that.
The manuscript I wrote about the presentation of the poetry, it was almost an accident. Not an accident that happened and blew my mind. I was invited to have a presentation of dramatic interpretation of the poem at the University of Pennsylvania in a ceremony they did called Poets and Writers at Penn. And it was a whole weekend, Saturday and Sunday, of talks about this, presentations of that, poetry readings, book presentations, and my job in that activity was to have a talk in one of the classrooms, to have a talk about dramatic interpretation of the poem, how the poem should be read before an audience, any kind of an audience. And it was a kind of a successful event. I had about 23 people in the class. And what I did is I took notes of what I was going to talk about. And over the years, with experience I have here and there, I have improved that lineup of steps, and it became a manuscript that one of these days I'm going to publish officially.
Speaking of successful, let us know where we can purchase some of your many books that you've written over the decades.
Oh, my books are available in the internet, in some shops, not every one, especially in the last 2 years. I don't have to tell anybody that every shop has been closed. But in the internet, in Amazon, they sell them. The publisher lulu.com, they sell them, they offer them. And there are many places, Barnes and Noble, other bookstores in the area. I know I just found a couple of places in the state of Ohio, and even in New York City they have a couple of bookshops where they present the book, they announce the book, and people can make an order in the internet and simply go to the store and pick it up. So the book is available, like I said, Amazon has everything. These days, just about anything we want. And if you click on my name, a bunch of my books will appear in the Amazon website, and they can be purchased and delivered at home.
Is there anything else you'd like to talk about, the poetry presentation?
Oh, I could go on and on and on and stay here for the next 2 hours. But basically, be ready. Have the material handy. Don't make people wait. And when is he going to read? When is it? But one thing very important, I try to make a point. When reading the poem, do not make the presentation of that poem longer than the poem itself. That's ugly. The poem is important, and people are there to hear you saying poetry, not saying, well, last night I was writing, but I wasn't sure what I was going to do, so my mind went to... Don't waste any time. Just tell people, I'm going to read to you a poem about so-and-so, so-and-so.
A funny story between you and I back in the day when you used to host Northeast Culture Council. We had a poet, I forget the gentleman's name, but he would take more time up on the pedestal looking for the poems he wanted to read than the actual reading of the poems.
It happens. People are not ready. People walk on stage and say, okay, I'm going to read to you a poem. Let's see if I can find it. And I had it, oh my God, I think I lost it. Come on, you're wasting your time. We're wasting my time. I want to hear poetry. I don't want to learn that you're lost looking for a poem you cannot find, or looking for a page you cannot find. Go to the podium, read the poem, and get it over with. Don't give me your... But anyway, people are people, and we are not perfect.
And like you mentioned before, I have sat in poetry readings where the story, like you said, was longer than the actual poem.
It happens.
So we got a story and we got a poem. Mr. Martin, once again, we want to thank you for taking the time out in your busy schedule. Sit down with us. Remember to stay tuned to our YouTube channel, JJ Root Promotions, for all upcoming videos with Mr. Martin. And you can go to that channel and see the previous videos we've done with Mr. Martin. Mr. Martin, once again, thank you for your time. Have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thanks, John.